that's maybe what I prefer for people. But just no. But I think like writing it out, a lot. To have the co-chair title, it's the board that big. Do you think that they?
I like to. So I like to walk around with it when I'm talking. And this Michael
It
works.
isn't changing on its own, is it, gentlemen?
No, that's
All right.
That's yeah. That's
Are you just gonna control it from the laptop here?
if it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. If
All right.
If it's right there, we can just.
Cause I got a cue light. I mean, I got a one you could walk around with. I don't know, but they won't be able to hear you in the recording and the streaming.
Oh, okay. Does it? Will they hear this?
Yeah.
As long as we use the mic if we're walking around.
Exactly.
Okay.
Forward, reverse. Forward, reverse, and then there's a laser pointer on there if you want to use it. I'm gonna lay it here for you.
You're the driver. You're the driver. Are you gonna
Yeah, it's up to you guys.
I'm gonna use it. Yeah.
It's here if you need it.
Right there, where I got the stuff.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. So we got a mic there and a mic there, so we can. So
Each side.
yeah, we just got a mic. Everybody's got a mic.
Yeah, that space.
It's equality.
Also,
That's what I'm saying. Like during certain segments, if you got something to input, if I miss something, or
yes, and vice versa. Like I might need to turn.
Yeah, this is.
Turn me like I know you had thought.
I need to. Somebody got to take pictures while we're there. Should have brought my tripod.
I mean, I think it's being recorded.
But I think my agent wants stuff like social. It's that time.
Yeah.
I wasn't waiting for
Wait a few minutes and let's see. Okay, that works.
I got ADD, so I can't sit still.
Yeah, nah, me too. I ain't gotta do that. All right, I just got social. A little different.
Oh, hello. That's all right.
I don't think we're getting a crowd like that.
I think it's gonna be interesting.
I think you're the only one that didn't get the memo.
Online stream and there will be online questions. So I guess basically this is like needs and questions. Just kind of you can walk them and tell us during the
All right.
You can start anytime you would like, but it's up to you.
Okay.
Thank you for
When the crowd come in,
So, just open up, quick welcome, and let you guys introduce yourselves. Sure. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all this morning. My name is Emmett Sanders. This is James Kilgore and Kareem Golden. They're gonna introduce themselves in just a bit, but first, just thank you all for being here. I know that there is a lot going on here this morning, and the fact that you all have decided to come to a panel where we're actually talking about the lived experiences of people that are, within this technology, I think is really commendable. I think it's something that, that maybe we need to do more of, right? So I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about my experience, and then sort of turn it over to James and Kareem to do the same. Then we'll come back and just walk you through a little bit of what that experience looks like. So again, my name is Emmett Sanders. I am I am a project research with Media Justice. I've been working on electronic monitoring and other things for about 6 years now, and I entered that work wearing electronic monitor myself. I met James while I was wearing electronic monitor myself as a condition of my parole after 22 and a half years of incarceration. I came home ready to put my life together and found out that here's this device on my leg that completely prevented me from doing that. This technology that was supposed to help me and guide me through this actively prevented me from employment, actively prevented me from engaging with my family, and many, many other things. And so that's how I got into this work, and that's why I'm here. So I'll turn it over to James to sort of introduce himself.
Yeah.
You want to? Here you go.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I'm James Kilgore. Like Emmett, I didn't spend as long as he did in prison, but I spent 6.5 years. And when I came out, I thought I had freedom. I thought I was going to be with my family. The day after I was released, the Department of Corrections folks came. They put what I call a shackle on my ankle and told me I would only be allowed to leave the house Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And that completely redefined what my understanding of freedom was, what my family's understanding of freedom was. And since that time, I've really been spending a lot of time investigating this technology and trying to see where it's going and why we have to fight against it. I mean, I'm a prison abolitionist, but electronic monitors are a form of prison, and we'll talk about why that is the case and what we might do about it as we move on.
And Kareem?
Good morning. My name is Kareem Golden. I have similar experiences to James and Emmett. I did 15 years I wouldn't say prison. I did 10 years in prison and 5 years in ICE. Still imprisonment nonetheless, but when I was released from ICE after 5 years, I'm going to give you some more context of what happened, but the night I was released, I was given an ankle monitor in Alabama. I'm from New York, and I was told to find my way home, right? So no driving me to a bus stop. Luckily, I had organizers that I can contact that helped me out. I've been familiar with not having my freedom for a very long time in different forms. Electronic monitoring is a form of imprisonment that they say it's an alternative to imprisonment. So imprisonment can't be an alternative to imprisonment. It's just what it is. So how technology is used is what we'll discuss, using GPS to monitor you, which is inaccurate, right? A lot of the technology is not accurate, and we don't want to make it accurate because it's machine learning. So the machine has to learn on the job what the behavior is, and you can't predict human behavior or what somebody's going to do based on their background.
So we'll get to the slide now. Reform tech. We're here to talk about reform tech. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about reform tech in terms of like electronic monitoring and some other things that are out there, such as facial recognition technology that's used for border safety or something, or these, I mentioned ShotSpotters, license plate readers, gang databases as deterrents to crime. These sort of things are examples of reform tech. We define reform tech, drawing from James Kilgore actually, as the carceral humanist application of technology. It's technology that's implemented to repackage systems of commodification and control into seemingly more effective, more just, more humane versions of themselves. And this allows these systems to appear to address gross systemic issues, all right? Such as racialized criminalization, human rights abuses, and the continued link between capitalist profit and the deprivation of liberty, right? All without really ever addressing these issues. Indeed, not only does reform tech make it possible to preserve these injustices, it often expands them, both in terms of new markets and new populations that are subjected to it, and it sort of couches the bitter pill of carceral technology in this really nice package, and hides the really insidious nature of it, of the system itself. And ultimately, reform tech doesn't right wrongs. It doesn't right wrongs, but rather lessens people's ability to seek relief from them, right? Because it's presented this more humane thing. So, anecdotal versus empirical. So the question is, what is data? We're here to talk about our lived experience within this technology, within this reform tech. What is data? What does it look like? So recently there was a prison profiteer, who I'll remain nameless, released a detailed and frankly kind of laughable response to some of the arguments that we've presented over the course of the years in terms of EM. One of their strategies was to make the claim that people's experiences with electronic monitoring are anecdotal rather than data, as opposed to empirical data that they've collected. Now, while leaving aside the fact that this position essentially acknowledges the fact that the people's experiences on this are overwhelmingly negative. And so that's admitting that, and if you really think about it. But it also just dismisses these experiences as inconsequential. They don't matter, right? And if you think about that, we are profiting from these people, and we're subjecting them to these things, and we don't care how they actually feel about it, how their lives are actually impacted by it. That's what that's saying. And the idea that there's no empirical evidence, frankly, that that isolation and criminalization, all these other things don't have an impact on people is completely false. There's plenty of empirical evidence. We can look at all kinds of studies out there that say that these things have devastating psychological, emotional, societal, and community impacts. We know this. So that the idea that that there is no empirical evidence is completely wrong. Conversely, there's relatively little empirical evidence to suggest that their claims are actually true, that these things do what they say they do in terms of electronic monitoring. So, and in addition to that, it's ignoring lived experience is also ignoring what is a very real form of data, qualitative data that we're talking about. This is actual data. This is things that this is what we need to consider. And so it's really important for our standpoint to really include that in there. And so again, what does lived experience in these systems look like? So we talked a little bit about our experience, just reaching out and doing this work and connecting with people. A lot of the work that I do, that James does, is connecting with people who've been involved in these systems, who are currently impacted by them. And so getting a call from someone who is terrified to leave their home because they have this thing strapped to their leg, and they need medical help, they need medical care, and they're terrified to leave their homes. And they're calling, like, I need someone to advocate for me, to speak out on behalf of me. I've contacted the call-in center, and I've been on a hold for 2 hours, and I have a hole in my face that I need to be seen to. Or the fact that you have someone who can't take their child to the hospital or take their child to school. People who say that, I feel like I'm the child. My child has to go and care for me, get the things to care for me. And that's how this tech is being implemented. But just in regards to electronic monitoring, and I know we'll make the connection to other forms of AI a little bit later, but I just want to really, really stress that point that this is not technology that reinforces humanity, right? It's technology that that complicates it, that suppresses it, that makes human need much more difficult to actually address. And so why is it important to center these experiences, in these conversations, right? Well, firstly, because if you want to be ethical, you have to understand how technology, how this thing is actually affecting the people who it's being implemented on, right? And if you're like the prison profiteer who doesn't really care because it doesn't affect their profit margins, then you're not concerned about being ethical. That's a whole different conversation. But if you are concerned about ethicals, if you are concerned about being ethical, you're concerned about doing the right thing, which I feel like, because you're in this room, I feel like many people here are, then we have to actually listen to the people who are experiencing these things and how this technology is affecting their lives. It's just that simple. And frankly, I think that people with lived experience just have an insight into these things that the people who create this technology don't necessarily get to see. You don't get to see what happens in someone's home, when they're struggling to go and take their kid to the school, or do all this, all these things. That's not there. That's data that doesn't exist when these things are actually created. And so there are essentially like three groups. We can think about it. There are three groups, right? There are more, but there are three for this purpose of this discussion. There are those who create the technology that's used. There are those who enforce and implement the technology that's used, and there are those who have this technology implemented upon them, right? And the first two groups have a lot of say in what actually happens with that technology and how it's implemented, what's created. The third, even though they feel the weight of it much more than these other groups, have very little say in actually what happens with that technology. And so that's why it's important that we center this experience within these conversations. So I'm going to turn it over to James now, who's going to walk us a bit through carceral electronic monitoring and talk to us a bit about that. So,
Okay. Thanks. It's not on. It's on? Okay, thanks, Emmett. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call carceral electronic monitoring. That is electronic monitoring that's really used within the context of the criminal legal system, or what some people also call the crimmigration system. I'm not talking really about monitors that are maybe placed on somebody in a hospital that's suffering from dementia or things like that, but we're really talking about the basics of this. And I know this is a very tech-savvy audience, but probably, and this is very, in many ways, it's very simple technology, but I want to just make sure everyone's on board with what it actually consists of. So what kind of devices are there? And
I think he should.
Okay, how's that? No, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. So what kind of devices are there? So we call, you've probably heard the term ankle bracelet, right? That's that kind of terminology that normalizes this and softens what it is. It's not jewelry. It's a shackle. It chains you to the criminal legal system. So we call these ankle shackles, wrist shackles, which are becoming more popular, cell phone-based apps, which are really on the rise. Some of them, the old system was radio frequency based, didn't track location, but in the early 2000s, most of the devices began to incorporate GPS. We have some devices that are specifically for people who might have a case of DUI, and they detect alcohol presence in perspiration. And then some of these devices are that people get a beacon put in their house, which is supposed to boost the signal if they can't get the signal. And then we have two-way devices, which are sometimes used for domestic violence cases, where the survivor has a device, and where the person who is maybe under prosecution or criminalization for that also has a device. And if if the person comes close to the survivor, it's supposed to trigger a response from that person. So these are some of the devices and what they look like. Okay, so how many people are on electronic monitoring? This is amazing. I mean, in a conference like this, we don't know how many people are on electronic monitoring. There's no national database. There's no state-level database for electronic monitoring in any state. So we can't say at any given moment how many people are on electronic monitoring. Most local authorities, so that it's important to recognize that electronic monitoring in different forms, it might be, if it's pre-trial, it'll be based in a county or maybe a city. If it's post-prison, it'll be based in a state Department of Corrections. Then we have the federal systems, which are immigration and the Bureau of Prisons. So we have many different authorities. Each one of those has its own separate contact and set of policies, and they don't produce data. They don't produce reports, they don't produce assessments, they don't produce evaluations. We've been looking for these reports for years. They don't do it. They are not accountable. They get a free pass. You all probably do research projects, et cetera, et cetera. What's the first thing you got to say when you write up your research project? What's the outcome going to be, and how are you going to measure it? They don't have to do that. They don't have to do that. They can't even tell us how many people get sent back to prison or jail because they violate the rules, or if they do get sent back, what rule did they violate? The last national survey, and companies are also secretive, so they don't tell you how many people they have under contract. The last survey, the last national survey of how many people were on electronic monitoring was in 2015, and that they said there was 125,000 people on electronic monitoring. Well, we know that's ancient history. This is what we do know, because there are pockets where we have data. What we do know is that there are more than 300,000 people on BI SmartLink, which is a cell phone-based app, who are under the authority of immigration. That tracks their data, sends it to the cloud where it becomes part of a whole system of databases that are maintained by the Department of Homeland Security. We know that in some counties where data has been released, there's been a huge increase in the use of electronic monitoring. So for example, Harris County in Texas, where Houston is located, in 2019, they had 27 people on pretrial electronic monitoring, and by 2021, that was up to 4,000. Some of that was related to COVID. Cook County jumped up from 2,500 to 3,500. It's come back a little bit now. Los Angeles increased over 5,000% from 2016 to 2021. Indianapolis has over 4,000 people on electronic monitoring, and the Bureau of Prisons released 30,000 people during COVID. Most of them are on electronic monitoring, but we don't have any exact numbers. So it's promoted, as Emmett has said, it's promoted as a tool of decarceration, that is taking you out of prison, but what it's doing is it's putting you in another prison, changing your home into a prison, and changing your family into prison staff. So, I mean, why is this a problem? I mean, first of all, it's a problem because people say it's new. It's not new. It's a continuation of the surveillance systems and the control of marginalized populations that have been going on really since the beginning of settler capitalism in the U.S. It began with the monitoring of indigenous populations when the people that were responsible for monitoring indigenous populations, they were also shifted to become part of slave patrols. They were enforcing things like lantern laws, where black people who went out after dark had to carry a lantern if they weren't in the company of a white person. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then we have the whole situation which is going on with immigration. Particularly in the 1950s, we had something called it's hard to believe, but we actually had something called Operation Wetback, which sent back hundreds of thousands of people who didn't have proper permits, and we've seen the continuation of that today in the immigration sphere. So the other part of why is this a problem? I mean, it deepens the criminalization of marginalized populations. Once again, we don't have data that tell us comprehensively exactly what percentage of people on electronic monitoring are black or brown or indigenous. But once again, as Emmett has mentioned, we have the data of lived experience. We know who's being put on these things because we are in contact with those populations. And because we've come out of prison, come out of immigration detention, we know who's in there and who ends up on these monitors. In some places, we do have that data, which I'll come to in a second. The other thing that these electronic monitors are doing, and particularly now that they're connected to GPS and they're in cell phone-based apps, they're gathering more and more data, biometric data. What happens to the biometric data? We're talking about all these predictive technologies, predictive algorithms. Well, how do people's locations get factored into all of this as they get put in the cloud with the data of millions of other people? So it weaponizes the data. It becomes a way to punish people for violating immigration laws to come to work. It has the basis to connect people in different parts of the country, to connect people and families and create networks, digital networks that can be used to criminalize or punish people. As we say, EM is linked to phone functions now. So if you're sitting there on probation or parole, and the probation department says, you got to put this app on your phone, but we're not going to look at what's in your phone. How are you feeling about that? Where's your trust level that they're not going to grab anything else that's in your phone? For me, it's 0. But so that's the whole issue of, as the capacity of these grows and as the numbers of them grow, they become linked to the whole surveillance state kind of technology. So all the other technologies that Emmett mentioned before, the data from all of these connects people, deepens the criminalization of people. The same people who are on electronic monitors are the ones who are likely to get caught up by street cameras, by facial recognition, by license plate readers, by shot spotters, and so forth. And we're also now seeing that people in jails and prisons are having electronic monitors put on them. So they're monitoring their biometrics and they're monitoring their location even inside these institutions. So, and we know that these devices are not very accurate, so it's a concern that you have these devices measuring people biometrics in prison, for example, and suppose we have a false reading that your blood pressure is 210 over 150, and all of a sudden the prison decides they're going to take care of your high blood pressure. How is that? How much trust do you have in that kind of medical care? And so, as I noted, the communities are linked through all these forms of what we call e-carceration, the use of technology to control and punish people. So, that's just a brief summary of what the devices are, what they look like, what they do, who's on them. I wish we had more data. We have a lot of stories of lived experience, probably a decade of collecting those stories, and the echoes of the control and punishment that these things entail reverberate throughout all those stories, and they become more and more problematic as the technology itself expands in numbers and capacity. Thank you.
Don't want to follow that. Thanks, James. So, how to build an ethical nuclear bomb? All right, this is a question that James asked me, and we were talking about, and I think that was a good one we should pose here, right? So, I understand that we're living in what is essentially an age of wonder, right? We're living in a world where, we turn to technology to solve all the woes of mankind. We live in a world where we can literally hold the Library of Alexandria in the palm of our hand, right? But what we forget is that while we're holding it, it's holding us as well. right? This is the digital version of like the Hegelian slave master dialectic, right? It's we are chained to that technology just as much as it's chained to us. And I think that we often forget that. And while we focus on the positives of tech, and while some may argue that that trade-off is worth it, is it worth the keeping, right? Time and again throughout history, as we can see here, we can look and see the way that even the best of intentions have been, subverted, perverted, and transformed into something that's not good for us at all, right? And so these are just a few examples of that. So we can start with Sam McGowan and these enhanced radiation weapons, the neutron bomb, right? Which was a desire to build something that's a more humane version of nuclear warfare, right? A very, very deadly one that used high-powered radiation to basically destroy a populace without destroying the land, like these kinds of things, right? With doing minimal damage to the environment, whatever. But it's that. Like, how do you build that? How do you build something that's ethical? Like, is that humane? Is that ethical to do that, right? We can talk about electronic monitoring in particular with the Gable brothers, right? Robin Kirk, who invented this technology and saw it as a way to use it for behavior modification for juvenile offenders. Right, to positively change them, and who look back on it even now, and with some caveats here, but who look back on it and said, this thing became mutated. It was not used the way it was intended. It was a perversion in some sense, right? And again, when we look at AI, the use of AI, this is a more recent thing. Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, you all probably are much more familiar with than I am. Is now warning people that artificial intelligence is a danger to us, and it's something that we need to watch just as closely as we watch anything else, and for a number of reasons, right? Because it can make it so we no longer have the ability to tell what's real and what's false. It changes our reality in that way, and so. Again, like even in the best of intentions, these things can do real harm. And if you think about it, when we're talking about these bombs, when we're talking about electronic monitoring, when we're talking about AI, this reform tech, the harm that is being done is to people who don't have the voice that we do, who are not standing here before you, who are not speaking out about this, right? That's the people who are being harmed by this. That's the lived experience that we're talking about. So the mythology of technology. This is another James Kilgore quote, because he has a few of them that are very good. So technology is key to creating a more humane reality, right? So we look at technology as this thing that can make us somehow better. That can just make us better human beings in some kind of way, right? But the problem is that technology is only as good as the people who create it. It's only as good as the data that's being fed into it. One of the points here, again, is like technology is free from the biases of society. It offers a colorblind solution. And we all know that the word colorblind is while it may sound good, it is not a good thing, right? Because it ignores the realities of that people experience. But when we talk about AI, we talk about technology in the way that it's used, and that idea that can offer this colorblind solution that can remove these biases, technology depends upon the data that you feed it. And in a racist society, data is racist. All right? When we feed that data into it, we actually encode racism into this. Like it's in there. I've read reports from NIST and everything where they say, like with facial recognition technology, for example, right, that it's far, far more likely to misidentify people of color, particularly women of color, than it is, white men or anyone else. Like these things are embedded in the technology, And I want to be very, very careful here, because I'm not saying that we need to make better technology. I'm not saying that we need to make more accurate technology, right? I'm saying that we need to solve our problems. Because if we continue to feed our problems into technology, the technology is going to be problematic. That's what's going to happen, you know? And so one of the dangers of technology frankly, from my point of view, is that it absolves us of responsibility, absolves us of that responsibility to actually address the things that we need to address. So technology is a panacea for societal woes, right? The technology is a thing that can actually, we can fix crime, we can fix poverty, we can fix hunger, we can fix all these things if we just find the right form of technology. And again, like we're talking about human problems. We're not talking about technological, we're talking about human problems here, all right? Technology, one of the myths is that technology can precisely predict, account for, and positively change individual human behavior. Again, we are individuals. And Kareem made a very good point when we're talking. He can probably make it again a little bit later, but technology can't, you can't account for the experiences that people have, the things that they're thinking, the things that they're going through, the emotions that they have. This is not something that's embedded into that. Or the individual decisions that people make in the moment, that they're perhaps might be forced to make in the moment. It's very hard to account for that. And that technology, again, the ultimate adapter is just kind of a version of that. The technology is the ultimate adapter, and it's able to sort of adjust all these little intricacies of human life. And Kareem could give a very good example of what you feed into it doesn't always come out that way. And perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later. And again, the technology is evolution. It's inevitable. It's this thing that's going to progress. This is how we move forward. I think that's, I think it's kind of a false analogy. It doesn't really strike me as true. We move forward from struggle, from change. We change through struggle. Like that's our avenue, right? And it's by making mistakes, it's by learning, it's by doing all these things that we move forward. And I understand that tech learns in a very, but it's planned out. It's planned out. It's not something that's just kind of happens. It's something that's very intentional and planned out. And frankly, there is no, evolutional impulse to create some of the things that we're creating. There's nothing that, like it's not connected to any real things that we need. So I'm going to turn it over to Kareem, and he's going to kind of sum up some of the things we've talked about and make some points here. Kareem?
So thanks again, James. You definitely gave a powerful speech. A lot of the things that I was thinking about as you both were speaking, one of them being when the guy said that it doesn't harm, right? So to just ask the audience a question, social media requires approval, right? It's all likes, different things that's required, right? But when you send somebody out into the world with an ankle monitor, you're getting them disapproved. Everybody's thinking, hey, what is the reason that you have that on? It's prejudicial. You have to think it's natural, it's a human thing. We can't predict what that does to somebody emotionally. So having my daughter like, hey, we're going to the mall, let's cover your ankle monitor, right, before we go into the mall, because this is what we do, right? It becomes a thing. Those are some of the things that aren't being inputted. Then the racism of the technology, right? If I give you a tool, it's the person behind the gun, right? It's who is using this. Using ChatGPT, I recently gave it some commands and different things to say, hey, make a slide for me. Make these things based on the information that I plugged in that was specific to this conference dealing with racism. The pictures, just the conversation is not real. It has errors. So you can present something as so good, but it's error-based. And that's what a lot of tech does. It gives a recommendation. It's only a recommendation, but we live in a society where people are lazy because we have this productive nature, right? We all have to produce at high levels. So we're going to go and rely on tech because it's automating some of our work. I can get more done. And in that space, we lose the human qualities that we're supposed to have, especially when it comes to minorities, right? People that are already suffering. So because you are a minority, you have to make a different decision that somebody does that has privilege, whether it be the privilege of education or financial powers. So we go through these different things and we lack a human side. Technology is never going to be human, but we're asking for it to do human things. And it's learning, hey, this person acts this. You cannot factor certain data like, hey, the day I lost my grandmother, how that affects me 10 years later. What am I thinking about? You can't do it. Even if you put a chip in my brain, you won't be able to do everything, because some of us, you know, we have, I don't want to call it fake emotion, but sometimes we act how we think we're supposed to act in a given situation, right? Just because I'm saying I have these experiences, you can empathize, sympathize, or you can act like you're doing it. So the technology is doing the same thing. It's acting as if it's feeling those things, and this is supposed to be the response. When you give it data, like an ISIS situation, they might give it certain data and information. Hey, this guy committed this crime 15 years ago. He's still a threat to society today. You didn't factor in that the court found I was wrongfully convicted, but you're still factoring the data. And it's making a recommendation that I shouldn't be free. So after all these years of fighting and beating my case and winning my case, the computer is still saying no. And you're not doing the research, the human side, to go see the effects of what your recommendation is. It's just checking a box. If the computer tells you to check a box, you check a box. So who's in control? The computer is now in control. The data is now in control. And the data isn't taking a full picture. The dangerousness of technology and how we're using it. Many of you are familiar with scraping and data and how these breaches actually happen. So what happens when somebody didn't study programming or coding to the level that some of you have, gets that information and think they are a coder and starts implementing it different ways to be harmful, to pull data. So now if I can pull this data from this organization that doesn't give data and post it on the internet and say, this people is on an ankle monitor for this. This person is on this, he has an app on his phone. All these data breaches that happens because they're gathering information, and anybody can go and get that information if they know what they're doing. If they have some of the simple tools that we all now have access to, it's a dangerous thing. So some of the questions we posed was, do we want better tech? Why don't we want better tech? Because the human behind the tech is the problem. And to fix a human problem that hasn't been fixed since man has been around, the nature, whether it be evil or good, is something you can't fix. The only thing that I can come up with is possibly that we have to have counter mechanisms in place, oversight, tech that kind of holds people accountable, responsible, and we all have to look at the information and work together in that form to say we're keeping the checks and balance. There is no checks and balance on none of this tech. It's new, it's not in the court system, right? The Supreme Court hasn't ruled on anything yet until somebody makes a major violation on where this tech is going. Ankle monitors, we haven't even got to the Fourth Amendment violations of how ankle monitors work. There's some things good in tech because it allows us to learn at a faster rate. I believe it helps with recidivism. YouTube, Google, but Google is also wrong, right? If you don't fact check Google on the information that pops up on the top, you have to continue doing research because you can keep spreading wrong information. And if we're all learning from the internet that somebody learned from the internet without fact checking things, we're all going to be wrong. So we have a responsibility. Most of the stuff that I talk about is responsibility as individuals. How can we really lock in and say, well, I'm responsible for the work that I'm doing? What are my ethics? Is my ethics tied to a dollar bill? If I come up with this software to help the government monitor people, and I don't want them to do it, my software can be used any kind of way. But if they say, I'll give you $1 billion, does your ethics go out the window? That becomes a real question for anybody, because that's a human thing. A life-changing situation becomes unethical. Now you have to choose between minorities, people that are largely affected by technology, don't have the same education system, or nothing. So it's a tricky situation that we're in now that we're here in tech. I have a lot of information that I use, but I research. Everybody's not going to be responsible. If ChatGPT tells me something, if what's the Aurora AI or whatever the different ones are, and we check them out and they don't really give us the right thing, and we don't check it, if you're my teacher and I submit it to you, and then you go over it and you're like, oh, this is wrong. Well, what am I going to say? ChatGPT said it was right? Right? Because it's presented in such a professional manner. The computer is smart because the people that program it are smart, but it doesn't have all the information. It cannot predict human behavior. You cannot predict what somebody's going to do in any particular situation. Outcomes cannot be predicted by computers. A lot of times in the court system, you now have what they call, based on your zip code, your age, your race, they'll predict whether or not you can receive bond, right? But if I come from a different zip code and I commit the same crime, I'll receive bond based on my skin color. Prime example, what happened in the Capitol on January 6th. The computer's predicting who should go free. If those were minorities, I can tell you they wouldn't have been freed. They wouldn't have got bond. But the computer is saying, because this person is from this neighborhood, you can free him, and he won't commit the crime again. So it's not accurate information, but we are continuing to go and say, well, no, tech is good, because it's the thing that automates our life. The people that need to use tech in those criminal justice systems don't want to do the work. So the easiest route is to always go with the first recommendation. The computer's right. If my boss tells me the computer's right, listen to the computer. Whatever the computer tells you to do, that's what you do. Then who's going to be accountable? Nobody. You can't hold the device accountable. I'm going to pull the plug on you and tell you, oh, you just ruined a human life, so I'm not turning you back on. There is no accountability in anything. So how can you counter it, right? If you are the programmer, the coder, the person that's creating the tech, to the good versus the bad, right? Do we want that? Are we going to say we're tech heroes, right? We're going to create something to monitor and to counteract these things when somebody has to get behind that computer. And on any given day, if they so choose, they can input data that is racist or restrictive for any of us. It's not just a me thing. It's not just for anything. Once technology takes control and we start doing what we're doing now with the phones, it tells us every single thing. I remember things like MapQuest, right? Where you had to print out your whole paper and travel like that the hard way, or go get a map. Now you have Google Maps. These are computers. GPS is not always accurate. You've been lost by using this. So now when the court system tells me, well, a bank got robbed at 8:15 p.m. Well, not 8:15 a.m. And you were in the area because you had on this GPS, right? Well, it's not always accurate, but you're going to pick me up and put me in prison because I was in the area of the time that something occurred. My GPS. I could have been in that area at 5 a.m. And this is from personal experience, not the bank robbery stuff, but me being on the highway at 8:15, having a check-in at 2 p.m., and then at 2 p.m. they're telling me I'm on the highway. I'm not where I'm supposed to be at. So then I have to go through and document not to be violated because the computer is telling you this is where he is. So are we going to say, oh, yes, we need more high-powered technology to pinpoint accuracy? We can trick computers, right? They have people that use VPNs and different ways to get around location monitoring, right? It can be tricked. So it's no perfecting it because it's learning on the job. And who are the teachers? Humans. We're not perfect. So what is the solution? Is it good versus evil, right? Who are the users? How do we restrict? How do we know? I can't predict that you're going to do something bad tomorrow. I don't know when you walk out that door if somebody's going to piss you off to the level of no return. And you're going to say, well, I have this powerful tool in my hand, and I'm going to use it in a negative manner. In certain places, it just shouldn't be used. It needs human supervision if there needs to be supervision. If there is supervision, until there's no supervision, it needs to be from a human, because I can hold a human accountable. If I purposely do something wrong to an individual based on my feelings or emotions, then I can be held accountable. But blame the computer should not be the thing. Blame the algorithm should not be the thing. I didn't stick, but it's pretty much accurate. Who decides? And as a people, we should always decide. We should have oversight of what technology is being used on minorities, people who are underprivileged, and continue to escalate to people who are privileged. It has to be some type of oversight where technology is being implemented without, what's the word James used? Any accountability for data that they collect, any resources. If you're collecting data and you're telling us you don't have the data, that just doesn't make sense. And that's us. So we go to the questions.
So I would like to just hit a few of these points because I think they're very relevant to what we're actually talking about. So technology is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We create technology with the idea that we're filling a need, but the truth is that a lot of times we create technology to create the need and then fill it with that technology. That happens. Technology is a tool, not a moral compass. We think that we put an ankle monitor on someone's leg and that's going to be, positively affect human behavior. That's just not true. That's not true. And that's something that we've encountered and we know. Technology in these systems is responsive to the consequences of human need rather than the conditions in which that need is created. All right, that technology is this thing that we're gonna use it to solve these human problems, to solve what the people need, but we're not addressing the conditions that need is created in. We're not talking about like the undermining of Black and brown communities. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about the systemic, the stripping of education or leadership or all these. We're not talking about that. We're talking about crime. We're talking about license plate readers. We're talking about facial recognition technology. Right? We're talking about the consequences. We're looking at a moment in time that is far, far, far removed from the moment of need. All right? Technology is forward thinking. So technology is always looking, it's progressive, it's looking into the future. But again, these issues are embedded in our history, in the fabric of our history, in our fabric of our society. They're there. And so we're trying to move forward when we haven't even addressed what has happened in the past. Right? Again, technology doesn't remove the biases of society. It doesn't eliminate racism. It doesn't eliminate like gender discrimination. It doesn't remove these things. Right? It embeds them. It further encodes them into the system. Technology, how it's implemented, the manner and degree to which it impacts people's lives is an extension of privilege. the way that I have felt reform technology in my life, the way James has felt it, the way Kareem has felt it, the way that people with lived experience technology is a reflection of the privilege they have, in the rest of their lives. It's different from the way that people who don't have that experience have felt that technology or relate to that technology. It's an extension of your privilege. And we don't have that privilege. It hurts just the way all these other things hurt. And again, like, technology takes the place of social services and direct support. So technology is something we can use in place of human connection, in place of human interaction. That instead of you come out of prison, which that's a whole, we shouldn't even be there, but that's a whole other discussion. But you come out of prison and you need resources. You need to put your life together. You need to find employment. You need to find housing, to find clothing, to reconnect with family, all these other things. And the thing that we're going to help you do that with is an ankle monitor. It's a registry, or it's a database that we're going to put you in. And this is the thing that's going to provide what you need, the support that you need to find your way in this world. All right? And it's a falsehood. It's not real. But it does create this. It creates this absolution for people. It creates this absolution where we don't need to actually do that. I've done what I've needed to do. I've given you support. I provided that, and the rest is up to you. That's what it does. But people need support. They need resources. We need connection. We need community. These are things that we need, and technology does not provide these things. Okay. And so again, we're just going to talk now. We're going to turn to these questions, really like get into them and engage with you all and open it up for questions here. Just talk about, what does that support actually look like? What would that support look like? If we had, if we had that thing that made coming out of prison or doing these things an actual supportive process instead of one that's like reinforces dehumanization, right? What does that actually look like? So,
Can I throw a question out?
yeah, absolutely.
So, part of what we're trying to say is that we want the voices of people who are impacted by this technology to be heard in terms of how it moves forward. So I'm assuming most of you are somewhere involved in that process. So, in your work or in your looking forward, how do you think you might be able to incorporate new voices into who's designing, coming up with, who's deciding what the impacts of these technologies are? Because I was at the previous keynote, and it seemed to me there that we were looking for the perfect algorithm. And so where's the voice of the people who are going to be impacted by this algorithm? And I'm just trying to throw that out and to hear your ideas, because we want you to try to look at this in a different way and also inform us when we're coming at this, because obviously we're coming at this from a very different perspective than most of the people in this conference. So I'm really interested to hear some of your ideas.
Feel free.
All right, now that we're in the question time, I'd like to invite folks to use the microphone. Is this on? I am really grateful that you would join us. This presenter team has come from out of state a long ways to be here, and I want to underline the points that you've been making, for example, Kareem, about GPS, because there are people in this room that are using data science to do very advanced algorithms that would affect people's lives, but if we can't even get GPS right, and if it has consequences for people's freedom, it is so alarming. The kinds of, like the keynote, the advanced data science that's happening, and we need to take very gravely lived experience into every conversation, every policy conversation, every research conversation. So my question for you is about, at the beginning when you were talking about trying to understand how many people, what systems, would you share more about your efforts to try to get that information? And we know, for example, ShotSpotter has been extremely combative with people trying to get transparency about the accuracy of their system. So if there's anything you could share about talking to the vendors, talking to the governments, trying to get this information and the organizing that you've been doing for years, thank you.
So, I mean, we've used pretty traditional method. I mean, we started off by just interviewing people that have been on electronic monitoring. And because when we looked around, I mean, we sent dozens and dozens of FOIAs and so forth, just trying to get that information out of people and out of authorities. And basically, we got very little. And we found that in many cases, they said, when we asked, well, what percentage of the people who are on electronic monitoring, for example, are black or brown, they say, well, we don't keep that data. Well, we know they know who's on the monitor. We know they know their race, but they say they don't keep that as a separate category, so they can't answer that. And I mean, so we tried to fight for, we fought for legislation in Illinois. We got legislation passed for people who are on electronic monitors coming out of prison, which said that the Prisoner Review Board and the IDOC had to generate a report each year to say what, who was on it, gender and racial breakdown, what violations there were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we got that passed in 2019. Not a single report has been done. They say they don't have the capacity. And I mean, to be honest, we haven't had the capacity on the ground to pressure them. I don't know, Ed, can I put you on the spot here? Because, I mean, Ed Vogel has done a lot of work in Chicago and in Illinois with various groups, Invisible Institute and so forth, that have done a lot of work on trying to get some of this information. But I just want to say that you can't, the data doesn't help if you don't have an organization that can follow up on the data and force people to act on the data. And this is about, we're talking about these companies like BI, the biggest electronic monitoring company, who is a subsidiary of the GEO Group, the largest private prison operator in the world. How do you bring them to the table? They just say, no, we don't have to talk about this, and we haven't been able to force them to. But is it okay if I hand over to Ed, who's done a lot of work on this?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what I would just add to what James has been talking about is public records requests can only go so far. I don't know if folks are familiar with them, using them. Very useful, getting a lot of data, a lot of information. One group I'm a part of, Lucy Parsons Labs, which is an organization here in Chicago. What was this? In 2017, we filed a lawsuit to make the crime lab at the University of Chicago FOIA-able because they were serving a government function, was the argument, because they had so many government contracts. So I think to what they're all talking about is one aspect of this in terms of data and transparency is the intentionality in the systems to make all of this opaque. So the data is not there intentionally. And I think there's an element to what James is referring to in terms of needing to create the infrastructure and the systems to try to create accountability. But the big difference is, or the big problem is that there actually is no mechanism in place to what you're referring to. And so much of this actually comes down to, I think, and this is a big question, I think, for this crowd too, is the way in which we can build power at the local level, not only to increase voices in these conversations, but to actually push back on the ground. So, what is the role of academics, of technologists, in terms of organizing and supporting that? And I think that's a layered conversation, but I think that's something that we should all be considering and thinking about, because in reality, I think that's the only way that any of this change is going to happen, is if we can actually build power on the ground. And there's a much more nuanced conversation that needs to be had around what that looks like for folks who aren't directly impacted per se, which is also a layered idea, but what does that look like for us to be in conversation and building power? I don't know if that gets at what you were thinking, James.
I was, but go ahead. Hold on. Can you hear me? Okay. So one of the things that we talked about obviously is FOIA, right? And FOIA is often redacted when you get it, so you can't get the information. So looking at my ankle monitor, having to change, I probably went through at least 20 ankle monitors in 18 months. I realized that they use SIM cards, right, to use the GPS. And SIM cards are often issued by companies like Verizon, AT&T, so they have contracts with BI. And we discussed having some organizing going on against those companies that are violating the Fourth Amendment that we didn't contract, because I don't have a contract with Verizon to monitor my location. I might sign something for supervision with BI if I did, but oftentimes we're contracting with these agencies and not knowing it. So that's one of the things, but there is no technology for GPS to be tracked. I believe it's like you have to have access to Wi-Fi, right? If you don't have access to Wi-Fi, you need a SIM card. If we take the SIM cards out of the ankle monitoring, there is no ankle monitor, according to what I'm saying. Like, that's just what I see. So I don't know if anybody has something to give that solution some answers.
So I just wanted, just to build on what Ed was saying also, that when we were able to pass a law, the reason we were able to pass the law is that we started with the stories of people who were impacted. And we took those stories into the state legislature. And the state legislators knew absolutely nothing about electronic monitoring or the fact that people were being kept in their house 24 hours a day and not able to do things. And only when they heard those stories were we able to build some impetus to have a bill put forward and have it passed in the state legislature. But that involved bringing in lawyers, bringing in academics, bringing in researchers, and bringing in impacted folks to have those conversations with decision makers. So it's an organizing effort. And sometimes I know researchers don't easily think about organizing. It's not sort of what people are trained to do naturally. I'm not saying, obviously, if you're here, you must have some desire to be with other people and working together. But it's just something to think about. How do you magnify the impact of your research by connecting it to other political forces?
I'm always way too short for these. Yeah, so I have a couple things, and I promise I will be short. So one is I wanted to note that, like, as Dobbs has been rolling out over the country, like, who is impacted by this is now, like, the majority of the people in this room. So I want to just, like, encourage everyone in the audience to think more broadly about, like, their work and, like, the fact that if you have the ability or, like, to give birth, like, you are potentially going to be impacted by your own algorithms. And then I had a question, which is, I'm curious if any research has been done or, like, there has been any movement on finding out kind of what the afterlife of these data are. So, like, I know you mentioned, like, kind of all the data harvesting that's happening. Like, do we know anything about what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, James could definitely address that. But one thing I will say just very, very quickly. So I was incarcerated in 1994. I came home in 2016. When I came home, I was shocked to see the way that we as a society have internalized surveillance as a form of safety. Every one of us in here, and this is where this point actually comes in, is every one of us in here are subjected to surveillance. The surveillance that we've experienced is an extreme form of surveillance, but it's not an isolated incident. This is something that is within the fabric of our society, and to your point, that we really need to think about in that way, because this technology is impacting us all. And in particular, in Texas, for example, they've passed some pretty terrible laws recently, and they've also really tried to like criminalize reproductive rights and these things like this. And so they had a database. There was a website where people could make anonymous reports of people seeking abortions or seeking health care, basic health care. And could use this to like criminalize people, and and so like these are this is not people who've been to prison or been through the immigration. Like this is everyone. This is through the fabric of our society. In terms of the data collection, we do know that there are a number of contracts with like electronic monitoring companies where they have a provision, for example, to keep it for 7 years. But in many cases, like there is no provision as to what actually happens with that data. And James can actually talk about this in much more depth. But just very briefly, that it is the Wild West of data collection. It is, there's very, very little regulation as to actually how long it's kept, how it's stored, who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it, or what happens to it. So
So I don't think there's been a huge amount of work done on this. I think the most important work has probably been done on immigration, when organizations like Mi Gente, Just Futures Law, and so forth have done pretty extensive studies of companies like LexisNexis and so forth that have been gathering this data and kind of looking at the impact of some of these things, and tracked, for example, to the tracked workers who are in a certain factory, and then use that as a basis to have a raid on that factory and so forth. So there's been some of that, but I think the Dobbs decision might stir a whole initiative to do some other kinds of follow-up on this, because it's a mass mobilization, probably larger than anything we've seen on, certainly in the criminal legal system. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add. Do you want to talk about that?
We can just say this. So, I think the easiest thing to say that if it's being collected, it's being sold. Like if LexisNexis has it, it's being sold. If it's what's the other one? SageStream, just any one of the different groups that report personal public records. Yeah, it's Libre. Just the different organizations. You just have to assume that it's being sold, because that's the only reason why they collect data, or to predict outcomes if we do this, if we do that. But for people in this that have been affected by the prison system, nobody cares, right? If it's an immigration thing, they definitely don't care. Just so to speak, as by and at large, nobody cares if the information is being gathered from those two particular groups, and it's lesser and less in each situation. Is being a double minority. If you're, black and a migrant, it's what it is.
It's to Kareem's point. This is a continuation of the commodification of black and brown communities in large part. That's what we're talking about here. It's a continuation, not a new thing, but a continued form of commodification through the use of technology. I see there's someone else.
Thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed this workshop. So I wanted to start by answering your question, James, that you throw to the audience. So I'm an academic. Well, I'm a human being, and I work for a university based in the UK. And for instance, the way that I've been challenging power, because I think that this is what motivates me and why I stay in academia, is because I think that the privilege that academia give me, I can challenge power. And for instance, 2 years ago, I was this kind of like computer scientist trying to be like this perfect algorithm and try to implement fairness. But then I arrived at one point in my career, I was like, what is the point of that? Because you cannot challenge power, but just like implementing fairness metrics into algorithms. So I move into like, how can I use my skills as a computer scientist and mathematician in order to challenge power? And for instance, I work in a project where I implemented algorithms in order to extract information about companies hired by the European Union in order to implement technology at the border. And for instance, these algorithms have created a database where I structure all the content of these contracts. So I could also analyze the connections between these companies. And I found that, for instance, companies in the European Union they are creating like an oligopoly because, like, for instance, all these large-scale biometric systems implemented for border control are developed by 5-6 companies, and they are not Google, they are not Microsoft, they are not Amazon, they are like IDEMIA, they are like Thales, they are Atos. So, like some Indra also, so some companies that might be like around here and people don't talk about, but they have a lot of power. So this is how I'm challenging power.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yes, yeah.
Can we give her a round of applause for her?
I mean, I didn't want to sell my book, but I think it's important to also like see other types of like activism in academia. And this is also another thing I wanted to say. I've been targeted as an activist because in academia there is a lot of like people don't like when you're like doing activism in your role as an academic. Saying that, I have like 2 questions. The first one is ways of international solidarity. If you have like tried to connect with other communities that are struggling, because for instance, your talk remembers me to smart watches using by the Home Office in the UK. So they are putting smart watches on migrants in order to monitor, also like surveil their movements around the country. So this is my question: if you have tried to connect also like with other oppressed communities. And the second question is like, what do you think about these academics doing research on, for instance, analyzing bias in facial recognition because they say that, facial recognition is biased because it doesn't detect like black faces as well as white faces, and they are using like metrics and in order to make these technologies more accurate and, to have like the same accuracy among different demographic groups. So how do you feel about that, about making these, surveillance technologies more accurate and more like fair?
Thanks. So if it's okay, I would just like to respond to the second question first. And that's, again, like the solution is not to make a better technology. The solution is not to make something that can more accurately incarcerate someone, right? The solution is to actually address the biases in our society, right? And tech can't do that. It cannot do that. And I don't know that Kareem and James can elaborate on it a little bit more, but I just really wanted to address that. The second thing is, to your first point, to your first question, and there's other things there as well, but we're actually, James and I are actually going to be engaging in an international conference on electronic monitoring in Brazil here in about a week. And so it's a group of people who are coming together who have some concerns about electronic monitoring from many different places, and this is the first time this is kind of happening, but there are a lot of people. This is some people are recognizing ethical issues with this technology all over the place, and are really trying to make an effort to address it all over the place. So I'll turn it over to James.
Just one thing. I mean, I've had some interaction with people in the UK and in other European countries about this, but in preparation to go to Brazil and doing a little reading, and in Brazil, I mean, Brazil has really vicious police killings of primarily black people. And in Brazil, people with electronic monitors are targeted by the death squads. So people are terrified to go out, even if they're wearing an electronic monitor. We might get name called, we might get people looking at us. In Brazil, people are getting killed for wearing these things. And then there's a whole situation where there's so-called gangs, and one gang wears their ankle monitors on the left, and one gang wears the shackles on the right. And if they go into the wrong territory with the shackle on the wrong leg, it's a problem. So we're looking at a whole set of different problems there, whereas in Europe, most of this technology is much less punitive, and it's also embedded in a social service system where the people who are on the monitor are much more likely to have access to housing, to employment, to child care, to all those kinds of benefits, whereas we know we have what we call a naked welfare state here in the US. There's nothing there for people to actually benefit them, and so when you're on a monitor and you can't work, you're just totally punished and unable to fend for yourself. I don't know if you want to.
I definitely appreciate the question and the work that you're doing, and I definitely want to find out more about how we can do that on this side of the world. I had a brother he lives in England, and he's writing a research paper on my life experience and dealing with different institutions. And I was just kind of breaking it down to him like, you're not living in a different society because you live with CCTV. So you have to live with surveillance all day long. It's just that we don't make the connection. A lot of times we go through life without making the connection that we are being surveilled. So in a sense, we're being imprisoned, right? Because that surveillance leads to unwarranted attention. It's a violation of privacy, right? And universally, we have rights to privacy, right? That's a human right. So how we work internationally, I wasn't invited to Brazil, but obviously for obvious reasons, I can't even go. But but that's the main thing, like connecting humans to each other internationally, because we all have the same fight and the same struggle on some level or not. Whether you have access to housing that we don't have on this side, you still have this governmental overwatch that's being done worldwide that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Oppression is universal. It's not specific to a certain location. It's not to a certain. It is a universal thing, and commodification is as well, right? Control is as well. And so, yeah, these are things that are. Here you go, James.
So I want to ask people a question. How many people here have been to an anti-war demonstration in the U.S.? Okay, that's good. I mean, I've seen this whole question of internationalism. I mean, you can see I'm old, man. I was active in the 1970s, right? And there was a much stronger internationalist kind of connection with particularly with liberation movements in Southeast Asia, South America, in Southern Africa. And most of the activists that were involved there were quite aware of the Palestinian question, the liberation of South Africa, and so forth. But somehow although we have access to far more information, we know far less about those struggles. So I really thank you for raising that, and I think also to Karim for raising the issue of having family members in other parts of the world that are carrying on a struggle, and how do we build those connections? So I think that's really important to think about.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks a lot for the brilliant panel. I have a question. I found very powerful your point about data is racist because the society is racist. And I'm wondering if, however, there is also, I very much agree, I work on migration, that technology has boosted the so-called migration industry and the capitalization on migrants and also on people in prison. But I'm wondering also how technology shapes and contributes to produce new needs, right? That cannot be matched, cannot be satisfied, in particular by people in prison or also by migrants, right? So and it contributes to shape the problem. How we the fact that most of the citizens in Europe, where I'm based, see migration as a problem, right? So technology contributes to shape our imaginaries of migration and also to instill some needs on the population that is stuck, for instance, in the camps, right? That are needs that cannot be satisfied. So I'm wondering if this performative dimension of technology that is not, I very much agree with you that let's not stop to the bias, but is not simply that mirrors the needs of society, but also shapes the problem and these needs. And related to that, I'm wondering how you started the panel with abolition, the reference to abolition. How do you envisage, so in terms, as part of this ongoing debate in the US, but is, of course, even broader, about abolitionist futures, right? And I have in mind Angela Davis' idea according to which abolition is not only about dismantling and shutting down, but is also about building up, right? So in which way this carceral continuum, confinement continuum, can be a powerful catalyzer for rethinking abolitionism beyond the focus on the prison or the immigration detention centers, so that carcerality is much spread across. And however requires this action of building up, of imagining new wars, that is probably the most difficult step. Because I see that in this moment, both the academic literature and the political debate is a bit stuck into either say, okay, let's abolish everything, right? Without, of course, then following up, because what does it mean concretely? Or focusing on, okay, either technology or these things that when, however, of course, the problem is the prison, the problem is the borders, right? But at the same time, the way in which the prison function or the borders function has also changed because of technology.
Wow, that's a great question. So I turn back to this, right? Who decides what technology gets paid, right? Who decides what people really need? Who decides what people, what technology is created to respond to what needs, right? Because the people that we're talking about, the migrants, the people that were impacted, and the people we don't get to inform what technology is created to address what needs. So this stuff is out there that is addressing needs that we don't really have, right? It's addressing needs that we're presented to have. Right? If you ask me what I need from technology, I'll say you need to make a technology that makes it so that my kid gets the same shot in school as everyone else's kid, or that that we have some kind of fundamental fairness, we have some kind of resources, our needs sort of addressed, and that point. But again, James, I know you reaching for the mic.
Is this okay? They both work. Yeah.
Okay.
Technology didn't tell us that. Definitely abolition and is the problem the prison. Did technology help? In some ways it does, right? And the need, I believe, comes from organizing, right? So if you say, well, we don't want prisons, right? Or the mass incarceration of a certain group, right? Then they come up with the solution of putting people on ankle monitors as an alternative, right? And we that are in prison, it's not really a choice for us, right? To come out of the 8x10 to go to the 75 miles or whatever they give you for space, or to be in prison inside your home, right? So that's the change that we settled for, not knowing the outcome. So we subscribe to things before we understand it. So now, the point that James made was, we turned our homes into prisons, right? We turned our family members into staff. And that's because of the desire to be out of one cage. So abolition is not asking for abolition without knowing the outcome. That's irresponsible. So when we're asking for the shutdown of something, right? I tell folks, shut down the jail, but we're still not shutting down the policy. We're still not we're not changing the governmental, what do you call it? Just the systematic racism, right? We're not changing what's ingrained into the system. The system is working as it should because the system is racist. If the system says, schools in this area should have cages on the windows, and then you go to a different neighborhood and the schools don't have cages, then the system is telling you one thing. If the system is providing the education budget, but is limiting where that budget goes in certain communities, then that's the system. It's not so much technology, it's the people that are running the system. So, but it's the person behind the gun. Then you have it like, are guns bad for protection? Are they bad for robberies? Yeah, that's a different argument. So if I want to protect myself, it's one thing, but if I want to oppress, it's a whole different argument. So how, I don't want to say that I'm completely against technology, right? I'm just more of the oversight with the human behavior behind the technology, because you're allowing them to perfect what their intent is. The technology does it on a larger base. So if you're into mass incarceration for $1, then I can do this with this system, this computer technology, this ankle monitor technology. I can imprison far more people. And it seems like an alternative, but then it has a larger effect on the people, when I take you to prison and you didn't choose to be there. So if you're in my house and you have to deal with people coming in and checking in and doing these different things, now you have a taste of something that you didn't have before. So that's a part of what we have to deal with. Dealing with migration and just the criminal justice system and how people look at it, I've been thinking about what I call positive data, right? So a lot of negative information is collected and put into the system, but positive data is not, right? So one of the things that kind of got me to a certain level with the prison system was I had positive characteristics that they didn't know about. So I had to submit that information to the judge for the judge to make a determination on who I am as a man, which is these different forms of research, paralegal studies, different things that I did to better myself. We don't have a lot of positive data. So in the immigration context, when somebody comes to your country, you have systems that are telling people immigration is bad, right? You have algorithms, you have social media that's propelling these arguments that migration is bad and these people are going to come and take jobs. So it's fear mongering. So now, and then the people, when they get there, they don't have access to certain things. Or you might give them a budget and they have access to, like in New York, we have dealing with mass migration from Texas, the buses that are coming in. Now you have homeless people that are like, well, we don't get treated like that, right? So it's a versus. Why are these migrants getting housed in beds when we can't get homes and beds? And you don't let them know, like DHS provided this budget. The government is providing the budget. You're just letting them think what they want to think. So now you have altercations based on that. You don't give, when people come to the country, do they have a leg up? They don't have a social security number or whatever number to get a job, or they need employment authorization to even work legally. They have skill sets that you may not have. So those things in and of itself, when you paint a certain picture and you use the technology to advance this picture of migrants being so bad for the economy, then obviously the citizens will have that kind of outward projection.
James? You want to say it?
Yeah, okay. I want to talk a little bit about abolition, right? Because I think there's two aspects of abolition. The first is imagining what the world would be like without prisons, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to imagine, and I think this is at least as important, what kind of organization do we need in order to get there? Because I call imagining a world without prisons, in a way I call that fluff abolition. Because you're coming up with this, unreal world and you don't have a way to get there. And you can sit around and imagine what it's going to be like, but what are you going to do? What are you going to do tomorrow to make that happen? And how do you decide what's going to work? So, for example, some people, when we've been doing this work on electronic monitoring for a long time, people say, "What are you worrying about this stuff for?" There's people in solitary confinement. There's people getting punished at the border, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're trying to say is, yes, and we are involved in those struggles, but we also see that this is something that we have to fight because we're looking 5-10 years down the road. Where's this technology going and what's it going to do? And we're seeing now that as we've tracked this, all of a sudden it's becoming more and more problematic, impacting more and more people, and more people are becoming aware of it. So now how do we build the power to fight against that in the same way that we're fighting for other kinds of transformative change? And I don't believe, if we go back to abolition in the context of enslaved populations, I don't think enslaved populations sat there and thought about what it was going to be like to be free without thinking, how are we going to deal with this shit tomorrow, next week? How are we going to plan our struggle for freedom? That had to be an integral part of that struggle. So we need to think about what that looks like.
Sorry, thank you so much for sharing your important expertise and perspectives. I wanted to respond to the question of how might we, as quantitative folks maybe, which I am, try to incorporate the lived experience of people who experience electronic monitoring into these technological discussions. I don't have many ideas about design, but I have some ideas about evaluation or the evaluation of these technologies. So something that you mentioned is the overwhelming qualitative evidence of the harmful effects, as well as a very mixed quantitative evidence base. So an example of something is connecting this to broader, more incrementalist paradigms of program evaluation. I think MDRC has an evaluation of supervised release in New York State, but I haven't finished reading it. So one idea could be to do something like a meta-analysis that's connecting qualitative experiences to the mixed quantitative evidence about any of the purported benefits of criminal justice. And then it sounds like from the kind of incremental logic of cost-benefit analysis, which is, again, a kind of mainstay of quantitative folks in this conference, then the story is quite clear that any way you cut the dice or any way you perform this kind of welfare calculus, that this is a bad system, and other alternatives such as social services should be preferred. That was also a pitch if anyone is interested in doing this.
Well, thank you for that. We have a sponsor?
Certainly,
It's not.
certainly, as I said, these people don't do evaluations of their work. So we could, I mean, just a simple example. These devices do physical harm to people, but they don't test, the companies don't test them. If you buy a toaster, they're going to test that thing to make sure it's not going to blow up or burn your house down, right? But they put this thing on your ankle, and they don't do any kind of testing to see what the impact of it is. So, I mean, personally, to be able to struggle against this, we should have the data about what's the impact of this on people. But there's and to combine one law school, Cardoso Law School did a study where they came up, they interviewed 147 people who were on ankle monitors from the Department of Homeland Security, and they found something like 80% experienced physical pain, 70% mental health issues, a whole range of things. But that's one study of 147 people, and we don't have a single, to my knowledge, a single other study that replicates that just to look at the impact. Like I said, they don't do evaluations. So, to do some kind of evaluation which combines the qualitative and quantitative, but also using that as leverage to say, these people need to be accountable. You're getting millions of dollars to implement this technology. Tell us what it does. Tell us how you're harming people. Tell us how you're making life better for people. They just get a free pass, and it just doesn't make sense. Oh, we're still going after time? This is overtime, right?
Yes, this is overtime.
Is this the first or second period overtime?
So we are apparently at time, but we can take she said we can take a last question if you'd like. So.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thanks for being here. I think it's incredibly important that people like yourselves come and share your lived experience with an audience like this. It's more a comment or an answer to James's question around what can we within the technology community do. And Kareem made the comment, well, in the shackle there's a SIM card, right? And you can trace that back to the other thing that is almost certainly in that shackle is because every tech company, large and small, uses it, is open source software. If it's not in the shackle, it is 100% in the server side of everything they're doing and coordinating that data. And I think a lot of us who do write open source software don't really think about that. We don't think about how it could or might be used. And so we just default to the Apache license or the MIT license. There are other licenses like the Hippocratic license and others where you can very specifically say, this software is not licensed to any police agency, to any, military, and you can kind of decide where and how. and it's a very small movement. Very little open source software is licensed this way. But I think to the extent that we spread the word, like you don't know where, when you release that open source software, it's going to end up getting used. Let's, in advance say, look, I am not going to contribute software to this. And in fact, in the longer term, this software will end up being used in places we don't want it. Now you actually have a legal claim and the ability to go and help shut some of this down. So I'd encourage any of you who contribute to open source software in any way to really think about using these licenses for everything you do, big or small. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Really grateful. And so I guess that's our time. Happy to chat, talk with anyone. I'm sure James and Kareem feel the same. And thank you so much for listening to us.
Please give a very warm reception. Thank you.